In an elegant parlor on Franklin Street, 5 of the city's wealthiest white women gathered for what Richmond society believed was their weekly charitable ladies' auxiliary meeting. These women were pillars of respectability, church leaders, plantation mistresses, wives and widows of Virginia's most prominent families. But what happened in that parlor every Thursday afternoon had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with a secret so scandalous it would, when finally exposed, tear apart Richmond's high society and force Antebellum Virginia to confront an uncomfortable truth. These 5 women had formed what they called among themselves the Sisterhood, a pact built on shared sexual exploitation of the enslaved men they owned. They weren't just individually abusing their human property, which happened constantly throughout the South. They had created an organized system for sharing access to specific enslaved men they had selected for their physical attributes, rotating them among their households, comparing experiences, and maintaining this arrangement for nearly 3 years before a single act of violence would expose everything and trigger a scandal that threatened to reveal how widespread such practices actually were among Southern white women who controlled enslaved men. Richmond in 1849 was Virginia's capital and one of the most important cities in the American South, a center of tobacco trade, iron manufacturing, and the domestic slave trade that had become increasingly profitable as the cotton boom created insatiable demand for enslaved labor further south. The city's population was approximately 27,000, nearly half of whom were black, split between enslaved people and a significant free black community. Richmond's elite lived in mansions along Franklin Street and Church Hill, Grand Greek Revival and Federal-style homes, displaying wealth generated from slavery. This elite society was rigidly hierarchical and obsessed with respectability. White women of the upper class were expected to embody purity, piety, domesticity, and submissiveness. They attended Episcopal or Presbyterian churches. They organized charitable societies. They managed households with dozens of enslaved domestic workers. And they were absolutely forbidden from acknowledging any sexual desire, especially any attraction to enslaved men, which would violate every racial and gender boundary that Southern society depended on. But the reality behind closed doors was far more complicated than the public mythology suggested. White women in slave-holding households had absolute power over enslaved people they owned or controlled. This power included sexual access, and while historical records focused primarily on white men's systematic rape of enslaved women, white women also sexually exploited enslaved men, though this was discussed even less because it contradicted fundamental assumptions about white women's purity and black men's supposed threat to white womanhood. When it happened, everyone involved had strong incentives to maintain silence. The women couldn't admit to behavior that would destroy their reputations. The enslaved men couldn't report abuse by their owners even if anyone would have believed them. And white male authorities didn't want to acknowledge that their wives, mothers, and daughters were capable of such behavior, or that enslaved men might be victims rather than threats. The 5 women who formed the Sisterhood in early 1847 were connected through Richmond's tight-knit elite social network. Margaret Whitfield, age 42, was the eldest and the group's de facto leader. Widowed in 1845 when her husband died from a stroke, Margaret had inherited a tobacco plantation worked by 80 enslaved people, a mansion in Richmond, and complete control over a fortune worth approximately $150,000. She was prominent in the Episcopal Church, known for her charitable work, and considered one of Richmond's most respectable widows. But Margaret's outward piety masked a different reality. Within months of her husband's death, she had begun sexually exploiting Thomas, a 28-year-old enslaved man who worked as her butler. Thomas was powerless to refuse his owner's demands, and Margaret, freed from a loveless marriage and discovering desires she'd suppressed for decades, became increasingly obsessed with maintaining this arrangement. Catherine Harrison, age 37, was married to a Virginia state senator who spent most of his time in Richmond conducting political business while Catherine managed their plantation 30 miles outside the city. She had borne her husband 4 children and fulfilled every expectation of a proper Southern wife, but the marriage was cold and formal, and Catherine had begun to feel invisible in her own life. In 1846, she started an exploitative relationship with Marcus, a 32-year-old enslaved blacksmith whose physical strength and intelligence she found compelling, though she would never have admitted that her attraction violated everything she publicly believed about racial hierarchy. Eleanor Cavendish, age 34, was recently married to an older, wealthy merchant who traveled frequently for business. Eleanor had married for financial security after her first husband's death left her nearly destitute, but she felt trapped in a loveless arrangement with a man 30 years her senior. She controlled the household in her husband's absence, including Samuel, a 26-year-old enslaved man who served as the house manager. Eleanor had initiated sexual contact with Samuel in late 1846, driven by loneliness, desire, and the absolute power she held over him. Lydia Monroe, age 31, was the daughter of one of Richmond's wealthiest families. She had never married, which was unusual for a woman of her class and age, and she lived in her family's mansion managing domestic affairs for her elderly parents. Lydia controlled the household enslaved workers, including Daniel, a 24-year-old man who had been raised in the Monroe household and educated alongside Lydia when they were children, creating a complicated dynamic that Lydia exploited when she began forcing him into sexual servitude in early 1847. The youngest member was Abigail Thornton, age 29, married to a successful lawyer who was more interested in his career than his wife. Abigail managed their Richmond townhouse and controlled several enslaved domestic workers, including Isaiah, a 27-year-old man whose literacy and education made him valuable for managing correspondence and accounts. Abigail had begun exploiting Isaiah in mid-1846, rationalizing that since he was her property, she could use him however she wished. These 5 women moved in the same social circles, attended the same church, and served together on various charitable committees. In early 1847, during a private conversation after a church auxiliary meeting, Margaret and Catherine discovered they were both sexually exploiting enslaved men they owned. The discovery was accidental, a casual comment that revealed more than intended. But instead of being shocked, both women felt relief at finding someone who understood. Over the following weeks, they cautiously brought Eleanor, Lydia, and Abigail into their confidence, discovering that all 5 had been individually engaging in the same behavior and hiding it in isolation. What happened next transformed individual exploitation into organized conspiracy. In April 1847, the 5 women formally created the Sisterhood, meeting weekly under the cover of charitable work. They developed rules and protocols. They would share detailed accounts of their exploitations with each other, comparing experiences and techniques. They would rotate the enslaved men among their households, Margaret borrowing Catherine's Marcus, Eleanor gaining access to Lydia's Daniel, creating a system where the women had variety while the men were passed around like objects. They would maintain absolute secrecy, telling no one outside the group. And they would support each other if suspicions arose, providing alibis and deflecting questions. The Sisterhood operated successfully for over 2 years, meeting every Thursday in rotating locations. The women's weekly gatherings appeared to be exactly what Richmond society expected: respectable ladies discussing charity and church matters. But behind closed doors, they were sharing explicit details of their sexual exploitation, laughing about the power they held over these men, and planning their next rotations. The enslaved men involved had no power to refuse or resist. Thomas, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, and Isaiah were trapped in systematic abuse by women who owned them as property, women who knew that if the men complained to anyone, they would be punished or sold, and who used that power to maintain their arrangement with complete confidence they would never face consequences. But the Sisterhood made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed the enslaved men they were exploiting would remain passive and silent forever, that the combination of legal powerlessness and the shame associated with male sexual victimization would keep them quiet indefinitely. They didn't consider that these men might form their own bonds, might share their experiences with each other, and might eventually reach a breaking point where continued survival seemed worse than the risk of resistance. The 5 men did exactly that. Thomas, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, and Isaiah all worked in Richmond households and had opportunities to interact at markets, churches, and other locations where enslaved people from different households encountered each other. By mid-1848, they had realized they were all suffering the same abuse, and that their owners were coordinating it. They began meeting in secret, sharing information, supporting each other psychologically. They discussed escape, but the risks were enormous, and all 5 had family members still enslaved who would face retaliation. They discussed reporting to authorities, but knew that enslaved men's testimony against white women would never be believed, and would likely result in their execution for daring to accuse their owners. They felt completely trapped. In October 1849, the situation reached a crisis point. Margaret Whitfield had become increasingly demanding and cruel with Thomas, frustrated that her sexual exploitation wasn't giving her the emotional fulfillment she craved. She began punishing Thomas for imagined failures, having him whipped for minor infractions, asserting her dominance through escalating violence. On October 28th, after Margaret had Thomas brutally whipped for failing to anticipate her needs quickly enough, something inside Thomas broke. He had endured 3 years of systematic sexual abuse and was now facing increased physical violence. That night, in a moment of desperate rage, Thomas attempted to poison Margaret's evening tea with rat poison he had access to as part of his household duties. The poisoning failed. Margaret noticed an unusual taste and stopped drinking after a few sips, enough to make her violently ill but not kill her. She immediately suspected poison and confronted Thomas, who, exhausted and broken, confessed. Margaret's response revealed the complicated nature of her feelings. She was enraged by the murder attempt but also somehow felt betrayed that the man she had been exploiting for years would turn against her. She didn't immediately call authorities, instead locking Thomas in a storage room while she decided what to do. But Margaret made a critical error. She confided in the other 4 Sisterhood members, calling an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle the situation without exposing their arrangement. The Thursday meeting on November 1st, 1849, was tense and fearful. Margaret explained what had happened, and the 5 women debated responses. Some wanted to simply execute Thomas quietly and claim he had been caught stealing. Others worried that would raise questions. They couldn't report the poisoning attempt without explaining why Thomas might have motivation beyond simple criminality. As they debated, they didn't realize that one of the enslaved women serving them tea and refreshments, a woman named Rebecca who worked in Abigail's household, was listening carefully to every word. Rebecca had suspected something inappropriate was happening between her mistress and Isaiah, and now she was hearing confirmation of systematic abuse across multiple households. Rebecca faced her own impossible decision. She could stay silent, knowing that exposing the Sisterhood would bring chaos and violence that would inevitably harm enslaved people, whether they were directly involved or not. Or she could find a way to reveal the truth, knowing it might be the only chance to stop the exploitation, or at least expose the hypocrisy of Richmond's elite white women, who claimed moral superiority while systematically abusing enslaved men. Rebecca chose exposure, but she was smart enough to know she couldn't simply tell authorities herself. An enslaved woman accusing 5 prominent white women would be dismissed immediately and probably punished for slander. Instead, Rebecca went to someone who would be believed. She approached Reverend Jonathan Mitchell, rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, where all 5 Sisterhood women were prominent members. Mitchell was known for being relatively moderate on slavery, supporting gradual emancipation, and genuinely trying to live Christian principles. All 3 women spent the rest of their lives as cautionary tales, warnings about what happened when women violated the gender and racial norms that Southern society depended on. The scandal had ripple effects throughout Richmond and Virginia. It forced uncomfortable conversations about white women's sexuality and power over enslaved people, topics that contradicted fundamental Southern mythology. Pro-slavery ideologists had always insisted that slavery was a benevolent system where white owners protected and civilized inferior Africans. They claimed white women were pure and asexual beings who needed protection from dangerous black male sexuality. The Sisterhood scandal demolished both claims simultaneously. It revealed that white women could be sexual predators, exploiting their power over enslaved men, and that enslaved men were victims rather than threats. This contradiction was so threatening to the ideological foundations of slavery that many Virginians simply refused to believe the scandal was real, insisting it must have been exaggerated or fabricated despite overwhelming evidence. The scandal also sparked a brief debate in Virginia's legislature in 1850 about whether laws should be passed explicitly prohibiting such behavior in the future. But the debate quickly died because creating such laws would require admitting that white women could and did sexually exploit enslaved men, an admission that would undermine the racial and gender hierarchy that justified slavery. Instead, Virginia's elite chose to treat the Sisterhood scandal as a unique aberration, the actions of 5 deviant women, rather than a window into more widespread practices. This willful blindness allowed them to maintain their ideological framework, while quietly understanding that sexual exploitation crossed all gender and racial lines in a system that gave some people absolute power over others. Rebecca, the enslaved woman whose courage had exposed the scandal, faced severe retaliation. Abigail Thornton, enraged at being exposed, had Rebecca sold to a slave trader within days of Mitchell's investigation becoming public. Rebecca was purchased by a plantation owner in Mississippi and died there in 1852 at age 34 from injuries sustained during a beating. Her bravery in exposing the Sisterhood rewarded with exile and early death. The other enslaved people who had testified to Mitchell faced similar retaliation. Sold away from Richmond, separated from families, their courage punished rather than rewarded. Reverend Mitchell, who had chosen principle over social standing by investigating the scandal, also paid a price. While he wasn't formally removed from his position at St. Paul's, many wealthy parishioners left the church, taking their financial support with them. Mitchell faced constant criticism for having damaged Richmond's reputation and embarrassed prominent families. He remained at St. Paul's until 1852, then accepted a position at a small church in rural Pennsylvania, effectively driven out of Virginia for having exposed truth that society preferred to keep hidden. In his farewell sermon, Mitchell spoke about the courage of the enslaved people who had come forward despite knowing they would face retaliation, and he condemned a system that treated sexual exploitation as acceptable as long as it involved people defined as property rather than persons. The 5 enslaved men at the center of the scandal, Thomas, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, and Isaiah, are mostly forgotten in historical records beyond the brief notoriety of the trial. Thomas was executed and buried in an unmarked grave. Marcus died on a Louisiana cotton plantation in 1851, at age 37, from exhaustion and untreated illness. Samuel disappeared into the Deep South slave system with no further record. Daniel was sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where average life expectancy was less than 5 years. He likely died there, though. No record survives. Rebecca requested a private meeting and, risking everything, told Mitchell what she had overheard. She provided specific details about the Thursday meetings, the rotation system, and the poisoning incident that had triggered the emergency meeting. Mitchell was initially skeptical, but Rebecca's detailed knowledge and the fact that she was risking severe punishment to come forward convinced him to investigate. Mitchell's investigation was careful and discreet. He spoke privately with several enslaved men and women from the households in question, and a picture emerged that confirmed Rebecca's account. He learned about the years of systematic exploitation, the organized nature of the Sisterhood, and the desperate situation of the 5 men who had been trapped in this arrangement. Mitchell faced his own crisis of conscience. Exposing this scandal would devastate his congregation and tarnish Richmond's most prominent families. But remaining silent would mean allowing continued abuse and betraying his religious principles. In mid-November 1849, Mitchell made his decision. He would bring the matter to church leadership and civil authorities. The scandal exploded into Richmond society in late November 1849, when Mitchell presented his findings to the church vestry and simultaneously informed the Richmond police about Thomas's poisoning attempt and the circumstances that had motivated it. The immediate response was denial and outrage. The 5 women's families and supporters insisted the accusations were lies invented by enslaved people seeking to destroy their betters. They claimed Mitchell had been deceived by cunning slaves. They argued that the very idea of respectable white women engaging in such behavior was absurd, and that suggesting it was an attack on Southern womanhood itself. But Mitchell had been thorough in his investigation, and he had convinced several other enslaved people to testify despite enormous personal risk. The evidence was overwhelming. Under pressure, first Abigail, then Eleanor, Finally, Margaret confessed to the exploitation, though they attempted to minimize it and frame themselves as victims who had been seduced by their slaves rather than as perpetrators who had used their power to abuse powerless men. The legal proceedings that followed were chaotic and revealed fundamental contradictions in how slavery and gender intersected in Southern law and society. Thomas was immediately arrested for attempted murder, tried within 2 weeks, and sentenced to death by hanging. The fact that he had been systematically sexually abused by his owner for 3 years was deemed irrelevant because enslaved people had no legal right to refuse their owners anything, meaning there was legally no abuse to resist. He was executed on December 15, 1849, becoming the sacrifice Richmond's authorities needed to restore order. The other 4 men, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, and Isaiah, were not charged with crimes, but were immediately sold to the Deep South to remove them from Richmond and eliminate witnesses to the scandal. All 5 were separated from their families and sent to cotton and sugar plantations, where working conditions were so brutal that most didn't survive more than a few years. The 5 women of the Sisterhood faced no criminal charges whatsoever. Virginia law had no framework for prosecuting white women who sexually exploited enslaved men because the law didn't recognize such exploitation as possible. Enslaved people were property, and owners could use their property however they wished. The concept of an enslaved person being sexually victimized by their owner didn't exist in legal terms. But the women did face social consequences that devastated their positions in Richmond society. All 5 were expelled from St. Paul's Episcopal Church for conduct unbecoming Christian women and bringing scandal upon the faith. Their names were removed from charitable organization rosters. They were socially ostracized by former friends who refused to acknowledge them in public. Catherine's husband divorced her, one of the rare divorces in Antebellum, Virginia, citing adultery and claiming he couldn't have known his wife was capable of such depravity. Eleanor's elderly husband died shortly after the scandal broke, and his family contested his will to prevent Eleanor from inheriting, arguing she had forfeited any claim through her immoral behavior. Margaret, Lydia, and Abigail retained their property and wealth, but lived the rest of their lives as social pariahs in Richmond. Margaret moved to a rural property and lived in near isolation until her death in 1867. Lydia remained in her family's mansion but rarely left the house, ostracized even by her own family. Abigail's husband stood by her publicly, but their marriage was destroyed, and they lived essentially separate lives in the same house until his death in 1859. Isaiah, the youngest, survived until after the Civil War, freed by Union troops in 1864, and lived until 1889, long enough to tell his story to a black newspaper reporter who documented the Sisterhood scandal from the perspective of those who had suffered it. Isaiah's 1887 interview provides the most detailed account of what the exploitation actually meant for the men who experienced it. He described the psychological torture of being treated as a sexual object by women who owned him as property, the shame he felt despite knowing he was the victim, not the perpetrator, the fear that any resistance would result in being sold away from his mother and siblings who were also enslaved in Richmond.